In the annals of Brazilian history lies a story so devastating that it challenges our understanding of human cruelty. This is the story of a man known only as Pata Seca, whose life embodied one of the most horrific aspects of slavery, the systematic breeding of human beings for profit. His name, which translates to dry foot, would become synonymous with the dehumanization that characterized Brazil's slave breeding programs in the 19th century. Brazil's relationship with slavery was unlike any other in the Americas. For over 3 centuries, from the 1500s to 1888, Brazil imported more enslaved Africans than any other nation in the Western Hemisphere. An estimated 4.9 million Africans were forcibly brought to Brazilian shores, representing roughly 40% of all Africans transported to the Americas. Yet the story of Pata Seca reveals a darker chapter still. What happened when the international slave trade began to decline, and plantation owners turned to breeding their human property? The practice of forced reproduction among enslaved populations was not unique to Brazil, but the scale and systematization reached particularly horrific proportions in certain regions. Pata Seca's story emerges from the coffee plantations of the Paraíba Valley, where the demand for labor was insatiable and the supply of new enslaved people was becoming increasingly restricted by international pressure and changing laws. By the early 19th century, Britain had begun pressuring other nations to end the Atlantic slave trade. The British Royal Navy patrolled the Atlantic, intercepting slave ships and freeing their human cargo. For Brazilian plantation owners, this created a crisis. Coffee cultivation was labor-intensive, requiring large numbers of workers to plant, tend, harvest, and process the beans that had become Brazil's economic foundation. It was in this context that some plantation owners turned to what they euphemistically called natural increase, the breeding of enslaved people to maintain their workforce. Pata Seca became a central figure in this system, chosen not for his skills as a laborer, but for his physical attributes that plantation owners believed would produce strong offspring. The selection of Pata Seca was methodical and dehumanizing. Plantation owners evaluated enslaved men like livestock, examining their physical strength, height, health, and what they perceived as desirable characteristics. Pata Seca, described in historical accounts as tall, muscular, and robust, was identified as ideal breeding stock. The terminology itself reveals the complete objectification of human beings. Enslaved people were literally treated as animals to be bred for specific traits. Once selected, Pata Seca's life was no longer his own in any sense. He was separated from any previous family connections and assigned to a specific plantation where his sole purpose was reproduction. The plantation owners created a system where he would be paired with multiple enslaved women, with the explicit goal of producing as many children as possible. These children would belong to the plantation owner from birth, expanding the workforce without the cost and risk of purchasing new enslaved people. The psychological trauma inflicted on all parties involved in this system cannot be overstated. For Pata Seca, every aspect of intimacy and personal choice was stripped away. He had no say in when, where, or with whom he would be forced to reproduce. The women involved were equally powerless, their bodies treated as vessels for production rather than as human beings with their own desires, fears, and dignity. Historical records suggest that Pata Seca was moved between different plantations as plantation owners sought to maximize the genetic diversity of their breeding program. This mobility meant he was constantly separated from any children he had fathered, unable to form lasting relationships or provide any form of paternal care. The children, in turn, grew up knowing their father only as a figure who had briefly passed through their mother's life. The economic calculations behind this system were coldly rational from the plantation owner's perspective. A healthy enslaved person could be worth significant money, and the cost of maintaining a breeding program was often less than purchasing new enslaved people, especially as international pressure made the slave trade more difficult and expensive. Plantation owners kept detailed records of birth, deaths, and the productive capacity of their human property, treating people like commodities in a ledger book. For the enslaved women forced into this system, The trauma was multifaceted. They faced the physical dangers of repeated pregnancies and childbirth without adequate medical care. They endured the emotional pain of having children who might be sold away from them at any time. They lived with the knowledge that their children would inherit their enslaved status, condemning future generations to the same suffering. The children born from these forced unions faced their own unique challenge. From birth, they were marked as property, their value calculated based on their potential as future laborers. Many were separated from their mothers at young ages, either sold to other plantations, or simply moved to different quarters to prevent strong familial bonds from forming. The plantation owners feared that strong family connections might lead to resistance or escape attempts. Pata Seca's story illustrates how the breeding system corrupted every aspect of human relationships. Love, family, intimacy, and choice, fundamental aspects of human experience, were systematically destroyed in service of economic profit. The plantation owners created a world where human reproduction was reduced to a mechanical process, where emotional bonds were seen as threats to productivity and control. The scale of Pata Seca's forced reproduction was staggering. Historical accounts suggest he may have fathered over 200 children during his lifetime, though exact numbers are difficult to verify due to incomplete records and the dehumanizing way enslaved people were documented. This number represents not just the extent of his exploitation, but the magnitude of families torn apart and lives destroyed by the breeding system. Each of these children represented a human being born into bondage, their future predetermined by the circumstances of their conception. They would grow up in a world where their father was a stranger, their mothers were fellow victims of the same system, and their own children would likely face the same fate. The generational trauma created by forced breeding extended far beyond the immediate participant. The psychological impact on Pata Seca himself can only be imagined. Historical records from this period rarely recorded the thoughts, feelings, or experiences of enslaved people, treating them as objects rather than subjects of history. However, accounts from other enslaved people who experienced similar situations provide glimpses into the profound emotional damage caused by forced reproduction. Many enslaved men and women forced into breeding programs reported feelings of profound helplessness and despair. They described the agony of being unable to protect their children, the pain of repeated separations, and the psychological burden of being reduced to their reproductive capacity. Some developed what would now be recognized as severe depression and trauma response. The breeding system also created complex dynamics within enslaved communities. Some enslaved people were forced to participate in the system, while others were excluded based on physical characteristics or other factors. This created hierarchies and tensions that further divided communities already struggling under the weight of oppression. Resistance to the breeding system took many forms, though options were severely limited given the total control plantation owners exercised over enslaved people's lives. Some enslaved women used traditional knowledge of herbs and plants to prevent pregnancy or induce miscarriages, risking severe punishment if discovered. Others engaged in work slowdowns or feigned illness to avoid forced reproduction. Some attempted to maintain emotional connections despite the system's attempts to prevent them. The legal framework supporting these practices was extensive and deeply entrenched. Brazilian law treated enslaved people as property, with no rights to refuse sexual contact or control their reproductive choices. The children of enslaved people automatically became enslaved themselves, creating a self-perpetuating system that ensured a continuous supply of unfree labor. Church and state often collaborated in maintaining these systems. While some religious leaders spoke against the worst abuses of slavery, many others provided theological justification for the institution. The Catholic Church, dominant in Brazil, developed complex theories about the spiritual benefits of slavery for Africans, while simultaneously blessing the plantations where forced breeding occurred. The international context of Pata Seca's story is crucial to understanding its significance. While Brazil was developing its domestic breeding programs, other slaveholding regions were implementing similar systems. In the United States, the domestic slave trade relied heavily on natural increase, while Caribbean colonies experimented with various forms of forced reproduction. Brazil's system was notable for its scale and the systematic way it was implemented. The economic success of coffee cultivation in Brazil was built directly on the exploitation of enslaved labor, including the forced reproduction that created new generations of workers. The wealth generated by coffee exports flowed to plantation owners, merchants, and investors, while the people whose labor and bodies made this wealth possible received nothing but continued bondage. The international abolition movement gradually increased pressure on Brazil to end slavery, but the breeding system actually prolonged the institution by providing a domestic source of enslaved people. This allowed plantation owners to maintain their workforce, even as international slave trading became more difficult and eventually illegal. Pata Seca's story also reveals the intersection of race, gender, and power in Brazilian slavery. The breeding system relied on specific ideas about African and indigenous bodies, treating them as inherently suited for forced reproduction. These racist ideologies provided justification for practices that reduced human beings to their biological function. The women forced to bear children in these systems faced particular vulnerabilities. They experienced sexual violence, not just as individuals but as part of a systematic program designed to exploit their reproductive capacity. Their children were taken from them not through random acts of cruelty, but as part of a deliberate economic strategy. The geographic spread of forced breeding programs across Brazil varied by region and economic system. Coffee plantations in the southeast were particularly likely to implement breeding programs, while sugar plantations in the northeast and cattle ranches in the interior had different labor needs and different approaches to maintaining their enslaved workforce. Regional variations in the breeding system reflected local economic conditions, cultural practices, and the availability of new enslaved people through legal and illegal means. Some areas relied more heavily on continued importation of enslaved Africans, while others, like the region where Pata Seca lived, turned increasingly to domestic breeding. The resistance networks that developed among enslaved people often included specific strategies for dealing with forced reproduction. Enslaved midwives and healers shared knowledge about controlling pregnancy and childbirth, while family networks tried to maintain connections despite the system's attempts to break them apart. Quilombos, communities of escaped enslaved people, provided refuge for some who managed to escape the breeding system. These communities represented alternative models of social organization where formerly enslaved people could rebuild families and communities on their own terms, though they faced constant threat of recapture and punishment. The documentation of Pata Seca's story comes primarily from plantation records and contemporary accounts that treated him as property rather than as a human being. These sources provide information about his reproductive capacity and economic value, while revealing little about his inner life, thoughts, or feelings. The dehumanizing nature of these records reflects the broader way enslaved people were documented and remembered. Their individual stories were subsumed into economic calculations, their humanity erased from official accounts. Recovering their full stories requires reading against the grain of these sources and imagining the human experience behind the cold statistics. Modern historians have worked to reconstruct the experiences of people like Pata Seca by combining fragmentary historical records with broader knowledge about slavery, trauma, and resistance. This work requires sensitivity to the limitations of the sources and the need to center the humanity of people who were systematically dehumanized. The legacy of forced breeding programs extended far beyond the end of slavery in Brazil. The trauma inflicted on families and communities had lasting effects that persisted through generations. The economic inequalities created by slavery, including the wealth accumulated through forced reproduction, continued to shape Brazilian society long after abolition. The children and grandchildren of people like Pata Seca entered freedom bearing the psychological and social scars of their ancestors' experience. Many faced continued discrimination and exclusion from economic opportunities, while the families of former plantation owners retained wealth built on their ancestors' exploitation. Understanding Pata Seca's story requires confronting the full extent of slavery's horrors, while also recognizing the resilience and humanity of those who survived it. His story is not just one of victimization, but also of the strength required to endure unimaginable circumstances and maintain some sense of self, despite systematic dehumanization. The international dimension of Pata Seca's story connects Brazilian slavery to global systems of exploitation and resistance. The forced breeding programs in Brazil were part of a broader Atlantic world where enslaved people's bodies were commodified and their reproductive capacity exploited for economic gain. Comparative studies of breeding systems across the Americas reveal both similarities and differences in how these programs were implemented. While the basic premise was the same, using enslaved people's reproduction to maintain workforce levels, the specific practices varied based on local conditions, legal frameworks, and cultural context. The end of slavery in Brazil came gradually through a series of laws that first freed children born to enslaved mothers, then freed enslaved people over a certain age, and finally abolished the institution entirely. For people like Pata Seca, who had lived their entire lives under the breeding system, freedom came late or not at all. Many of those who lived through the breeding system died in bondage, never experiencing freedom or the opportunity to make choices about their own lives and relationships. Their stories remind us that abolition, while crucial, came too late for millions of people who lived and died under slavery's brutal conditions. The transition from slavery to freedom was complex and often disappointing for formerly enslaved people. Many found themselves trapped in systems of economic exploitation that, while not slavery, still severely limited their opportunities and choices. The wealth gap created by slavery persisted, with former plantation owners retaining their economic advantages while formerly enslaved people struggled with poverty and discrimination. Pata Seca's story challenges us to confront the full reality of slavery's impact on human lives and relationships. It forces us to move beyond abstract discussions of labor systems and economic development to consider the intimate ways slavery violated human dignity and destroyed human connections. The commemoration and memorialization of stories like Pata Seca's remains contested terrain. Some prefer to focus on resistance and agency among enslaved people, while others emphasize the need to fully document the extent of slavery's horrors. Both approaches are necessary for a complete understanding of this history. Educational approaches to teaching about forced breeding and other aspects of slavery must balance historical accuracy with age-appropriate presentation. The story of Pata Seca contains important lessons about human rights, dignity, and justice, but it requires careful handling to avoid traumatizing students while still conveying the seriousness of the subject. Contemporary discussions about reparations for slavery often reference the breeding system as evidence of the lasting harm inflicted on enslaved people and their descendants. The systematic exploitation of people like Pata Seca created generational disadvantages that persist today, providing part of the moral and economic justification for reparative justice. The story of Pata Seca also raises important questions about consent, bodily autonomy, and reproductive rights that remain relevant today. His complete lack of choice over his reproductive life serves as an extreme example of how power imbalances can rob people of fundamental human rights. Modern human rights frameworks explicitly protect reproductive autonomy as a fundamental right, partly in recognition of historical abuses like those experienced by Pata Seca. International human rights law now recognizes forced reproduction as a form of sexual violence and a crime against humanity. The psychological research on trauma and its intergenerational transmission helps us understand the lasting impact of experiences like those of Pata Seca and the women forced to bear his children. Trauma can be passed down through families and communities in complex ways, affecting people who never directly experienced the original traumatic events. Recovery and healing from such profound historical trauma requires acknowledgement, truth-telling, and sustained efforts to address the ongoing effects of past injustices. For the descendants of people like Pata Seca, This process involves both individual healing and broader social transformation. The story of Pata Seca ultimately serves as a powerful reminder of both human cruelty and human resilience. While his life was shaped by unimaginable suffering and exploitation, his survival and the survival of his descendants testify to the strength of the human spirit even under the worst circumstances. In conclusion, the story of Pata Seca forces us to confront one of the darkest chapters in human history, while also recognizing the full humanity of those who suffered under slavery's brutal conditions. His life reminds us that behind every statistic about slavery was a real person with hopes, fears, and dreams that were systematically crushed by systems of exploitation and dehumanization. Understanding his story in its full historical context helps us better appreciate both the horrors of the past and our ongoing responsibility to protect human dignity and prevent such atrocities from recurring. The legacy of people like Pata Seca calls us to continue working for justice, equality, and the full recognition of every person's inherent worth and dignity. The daily reality of life for someone like Pata Seca was structured around the plantation's breeding schedule. His movements were carefully monitored and controlled by overseers who treated him like valuable livestock. He was housed in quarters specifically designated for breeding purposes, often separated from the general enslaved population to prevent the formation of unauthorized relationships that might complicate the plantation's reproductive plan. The plantation owners developed detailed breeding calendars, tracking the menstrual cycles of enslaved women and scheduling forced encounters accordingly. These records, preserved in plantation archives, reveal the cold, scientific approach taken to human reproduction. Women were examined by plantation doctors or overseers to determine their fertility status, and those deemed most likely to conceive were paired with men like Pata Seca during their most fertile periods. The medical care provided to participants in breeding programs was focused entirely on maximizing reproductive success rather than individual health and well-being. Enslaved women received additional food rations during pregnancy, not out of compassion but to ensure healthy births that would produce valuable new property for the plantation owner. Similarly, men like Pata Seca were given better nutrition and lighter workloads to maintain their reproductive capacity. The psychological manipulation employed in these breeding programs was sophisticated and cruel. Plantation owners sometimes offered small privileges or rewards to encourage compliance, while simultaneously threatening severe punishment for resistance. These tactics created impossible choices for enslaved people, forcing them to choose between different forms of suffering and exploitation. Children born through forced breeding faced immediate separation from their biological fathers and often from their mothers as well. Plantation owners deliberately broke up family units to prevent strong emotional bonds that might lead to resistance or escape attempts. These children were raised collectively in plantation nurseries, where they received minimal care and were prepared from infancy for lives of forced labor. The wet nurse system was another aspect of the breeding program that caused additional trauma. Enslaved women who had recently given birth were often forced to nurse the children of plantation owners, while their own children were denied adequate nutrition and care. This created a cruel hierarchy where enslaved women's maternal capacity was exploited for the benefit of their oppressors' families. The genetic theories that informed breeding programs reflected the pseudo-scientific racial ideologies of the time. Plantation owners believed they could breed enslaved people for specific traits like physical strength, docility, or resistance to disease. These theories, while completely unfounded scientifically, provided intellectual justification for treating human beings like livestock and conducting reproductive experiments on them. The seasonal nature of agricultural work influenced breeding schedules, with plantation owners timing pregnancies to ensure that women would give birth during periods of lower agricultural activity. This cold calculation meant that even the timing of conception was determined by economic considerations rather than human choice or natural rhythms. The impact on enslaved communities extended beyond those directly involved in breeding programs. The presence of systematic forced reproduction created fear and anxiety throughout enslaved populations, as people lived with the constant threat that they or their loved ones might be selected for these programs. This psychological terrorism was an additional tool of control and oppression. Religious practices among enslaved people often incorporated prayers and rituals specifically related to protection from forced breeding. These spiritual practices provided some measure of psychological comfort and community solidarity, even as they highlighted the pervasive fear these programs created within enslaved communities. The economic records of plantations reveal the detailed accounting that plantation owners maintained regarding their breeding programs. They calculated the costs of maintaining breeding stock, the expected return on investment from new births, and the long-term profitability of natural increase versus purchasing new enslaved people. These cold calculations provide stark evidence of the complete commodification of human reproduction. The insurance policies that plantation owners purchased sometimes included specific coverage for their breeding stock, recognizing their particular economic value. The death or injury of someone like Pata Seca represented not a human tragedy, but also a significant financial loss that plantation owners sought to protect through insurance. These policies provide additional documentation of how thoroughly human beings were integrated into economic systems as property. The seasonal festivals and celebrations on plantations sometimes included fertility ceremonies that plantation owners manipulated to serve their breeding programs. Traditional African and indigenous customs related to fertility and reproduction were appropriated and distorted to create cultural pressure for participation in forced breeding. This cultural manipulation added another layer of violation to the already traumatic experience. The medical theories of the time included beliefs about optimal breeding conditions, diet, and timing that plantation owners attempted to implement in their programs. These pseudo-scientific approaches treated human reproduction as a problem to be solved through careful management and control, ignoring the emotional and psychological needs of the people involved, while focusing solely on maximizing reproductive output. The correspondence between plantation families often included discussions of breeding program strategies and results, with plantation owners sharing information about successful approaches and seeking advice from their peers. These letters reveal how normalized the practice had become among the planter class, and how they viewed forced human reproduction as simply another aspect of agricultural management. The religious justifications developed for breeding programs included theological arguments about the spiritual benefits of bringing new souls into the world, even under conditions of bondage. Some religious leaders provided biblical interpretations that they claimed supported forced reproduction, while others remained silent about practices they privately questioned. This religious complicity added moral authority to economically motivated exploitation. The architectural design of plantation quarters sometimes included specific provisions for breeding programs, with separate buildings or sections designated for reproductive activity. These physical structures were designed to facilitate surveillance and control, while providing the basic conditions necessary for forced reproduction. The built environment itself became a tool of oppression and exploitation. The bookkeeping systems used by plantations included detailed records of breeding activities, tracking everything from conception dates to birth outcomes to child survival rates. These ledgers treated human reproduction with the same methodical approach used for crop yields or livestock management, reducing intimate human experiences to statistical data in service of economic planning. The legal disputes that occasionally arose over breeding programs typically centered on questions of property rights rather than human rights. When disagreements occurred, they usually involved competing claims to ownership of children or disputes over the value of breeding stock, not challenges to the fundamental practice of forced human reproduction. These legal proceedings further reinforced the status of enslaved people as property rather than human beings. The technological innovations of the period, including improvements in transportation and communication, made breeding programs more efficient and systematic. Telegraph lines allowed plantation owners to coordinate the movement of breeding stock more effectively, while improved roads and railways facilitated the transportation of human beings between properties based on reproductive need. The international dimensions of Brazilian breeding programs included connections to similar practices in other slaveholding regions. Plantation owners sometimes imported ideas and techniques from breeding programs in the United States, Cuba, and other locations, creating a transnational network of knowledge about forced human reproduction that treated people like Pata Seca as subjects for experimentation and exploitation. The psychological profiles that plantation owners developed for their breeding stock included assessments of temperament, intelligence, and perceived docility. Men like Pata Seca were evaluated not only for their physical attributes but also for psychological characteristics that plantation owners believed would make them more compliant participants in forced reproduction and less likely to resist or escape. The nutritional experiments conducted on breeding stock reflected the intersection of emerging scientific knowledge with brutal exploitation. Plantation owners tested different diets and feeding schedules to determine optimal conditions for reproduction, treating human beings like laboratory subjects while claiming to be advancing agricultural science. The seasonal timing of breeding activities was carefully calculated to align with agricultural cycles, ensuring that births occurred during periods when pregnant women and newborns would not interfere with peak labor demand. This coordination required detailed planning and record-keeping that further systematized the exploitation of human reproduction. The competitive aspects of breeding programs included informal contests between plantation owners to see who could achieve the highest birth rates and child survival statistics. These competitions turned human suffering into entertainment and status symbols for the planter class, while providing additional incentives for the intensification of forced reproduction. The training programs for overseers included instruction in managing breeding activities, teaching them how to monitor fertility cycles, identify optimal breeding pairs, and maximize reproductive output. This systematization of knowledge about forced human reproduction created a professional class, specifically trained in the exploitation of enslaved people's reproductive. The financial instruments developed around breeding programs included loans secured by the future reproductive output of breeding. Lenders would advance money to plantation owners based on projections of how many children people like Pata Seca might father, creating debt structures that literally mortgaged unborn human beings. The medical examinations required for breeding stock became increasingly invasive and dehumanizing as plantation owners sought to maximize their investments. These examinations, conducted without consent and often without regard for privacy or dignity, reduced human beings to their reproductive organs and functions, while ignoring their humanity and individuality. The psychological conditioning techniques used in breeding programs included reward and punishment systems designed to encourage compliance with forced reproduction. Plantation owners developed sophisticated approaches to breaking down resistance and creating psychological dependence, using both positive incentives and violent threats to maintain control over their breeding stock. The documentation practices for breeding programs included detailed genealogical records that tracked parentage, birth dates, and family relationships across generations. These records, maintained for economic rather than sentimental purposes, provide historians with evidence of the systematic nature of forced breeding while also reveal the human connections that plantation owners sought to control and manipulate. The escape attempts by people involved in breeding programs required extraordinary courage and planning, as they faced additional surveillance and security measures due to their perceived economic value. When men like Pata Seca attempted to flee, plantation owners mobilized extensive resources for their recapture, recognizing that losing breeding stock represented both immediate financial loss and reduced future reproductive capacity. The punishment systems for those who resisted breeding programs were particularly severe, designed to deter not only the individual but also others who might consider resistant. Public whippings, torture, and other forms of violence were used to enforce compliance with reproductive demands, while the threat of sale or family separation provided additional leverage for controlling breeding stock behavior. The
The cultural adaptations that enslaved communities developed included covert rituals and practices designed to provide some measure of dignity and humanity within the breeding system. Secret naming ceremonies for children born through forced reproduction, protective blessings, and community support networks helped maintain cultural connections despite the systematic attempt to reduce people to their reproductive function. The economic calculations that drove breeding programs included complex projections about future labor needs, crop prices, and the availability of new enslaved people through legal and illegal channels. Plantation owners developed sophisticated financial models that treated human reproduction as an investment strategy, with expected returns calculated over decades based on the projected working lives of unborn children. The international pressure against slavery gradually began to focus specifically on breeding programs as evidence of the institution's fundamental inhumanity. Abolitionists used testimonies and documentation about forced reproduction to argue that slavery could not be reformed or made humane, since it inevitably led to the systematic violation of the most intimate aspects of human life and dignity. The technological surveillance methods employed on plantations to monitor breeding stock included architectural features like centralized housing that facilitated observation, as well as systems of informants and spies within enslaved communities. These surveillance networks made resistance more difficult while creating an atmosphere of constant monitoring and control that added to the psychological trauma of forced reproduction. The seasonal labor patterns on plantations influenced breeding schedules, with plantation owners timing pregnancies to ensure that women would give birth during periods of reduced agricultural activity. This coordination meant that even the most intimate aspects of human life were subordinated to the economic rhythms of crop production and harvest cycles. The interplantation networks that developed around breeding programs included formal and informal arrangements for sharing genetic material, exchanging breeding stock, and coordinating reproductive strategy. These networks created a regional system of forced reproduction that treated human beings like livestock to be bred for specific characteristics and economic purposes.
The psychological warfare tactics used in breeding programs included the deliberate creation of competition and jealousy among enslaved people, manipulating human emotions to serve the plantation's reproductive goals. Plantation owners sometimes offered privileges or special treatment to encourage participation while threatening punishment for those who resisted, creating impossible choices that added psychological torture to physical exploitation. The medical experiments conducted on enslaved women as part of breeding programs contributed to the development of gynecological medicine while causing immense suffering to the subjects. Enslaved women were subjected to painful procedures without anesthesia, and their bodies were used to test surgical techniques and medical theories that primarily benefited white populations. The inheritance patterns that governed breeding programs worsened that children born through forced reproduction automatically became the property of plantation owners, creating self-perpetuating systems of exploitation that extended across generations. These inheritance laws ensured that the trauma and exploitation of breeding programs would continue indefinitely unless the entire system of slavery was abolished. The resistance networks that developed among enslaved people included specific strategies for protecting individuals from forced breeding, sharing information about avoiding selection, and providing support to those who were victimized. These networks demonstrated the solidarity and mutual aid that existed within enslaved communities despite the systematic attempts to destroy social bonds and human connections. The long-term health consequences for participants in breeding programs extended beyond immediate physical trauma to include chronic conditions related to repeated pregnancies, sexually transmitted infections, and the stress-related illnesses that resulted from sustained psychological abuse. The medical neglect that characterized these programs meant that many health problems went untreated, leading to lifelong suffering and premature death. The cultural memory preservation efforts within enslaved communities included oral traditions that maintained some record of individual identities and family connections, despite the systematic attempt to erase them. Elders within enslaved communities sometimes served as informal historians, preserving stories and genealogies that provided some measure of continuity and identity for people whose official records reduced them to economic statistics. The legal loopholes that plantation owners exploited to maintain breeding programs, even as slavery came under increasing criticism, included technical distinctions between different forms of forced reproduction and arguments about property rights that superseded individual autonomy. These legal strategies allowed the continuation of systematic exploitation even as public opinion began to turn against the most extreme practices of slavery. The international comparisons reveal that while forced breeding occurred throughout slaveholding society, the scale and systematization in Brazil was particularly extensive due to the size of the enslaved population, the duration of the slave trade, and the specific economic conditions that made breeding programs profitable. Understanding these comparative dimensions helps place Pata Seca's story within the broader context of global slavery and exploitation. The therapeutic interventions that some enslaved people developed included traditional healing practices, spiritual rituals, and community support systems that provided some measure of psychological protection against the trauma of forced reproduction. These indigenous approaches to healing and resilience demonstrate the creativity and strength that people maintained even under the most dehumanizing circumstances. The economic ripple effects of breeding programs extended beyond individual plantations to influence regional labor markets, land values, and investment patterns throughout slaveholding areas. The systematic production of new enslaved people through forced reproduction shaped entire economies and contributed to the entrenchment of slavery as a fundamental economic institution. The documentation gaps in historical records reflect the deliberate erasure of enslaved people's perspectives and experiences, with most surviving accounts written from the viewpoint of plantation owners and overseers. Recovering the full human story of people like Pata Seca requires historians to read between the lines of these biased sources and imagine the experiences that were systematically excluded from official record. The generational impacts of breeding programs created complex family structures where biological relationships existed alongside the artificial kinship systems that enslaved communities created to provide mutual support and protection. Children born through forced reproduction often grew up in communities that served as extended families while remaining legally separated from their biological parents. The philosophical questions raised by breeding programs about human nature, dignity, and rights provided intellectual ammunition for both defenders and critics of slavery. While some used these practices to argue for the fundamental humanity and rights of all people, others attempted to justify them through theories about racial hierarchy and the supposed benefits of enslaved people's controlled reproduction. The technological legacy of breeding programs included the detailed record-keeping systems, surveillance techniques, and population management strategies that later influenced other forms of institutional control and social organization. The methods developed for managing forced human reproduction provided models that were adapted for use in prisons, factories, and other institutions designed to control and exploit human labor. The memorial practices that eventually developed to commemorate people like Pata Seca faced challenges in balancing the need to honor their suffering with the desire to emphasize their resilience and humanity. These commemorative efforts continue to evolve as societies grapple with how to remember and learn from historical trauma while avoiding the re-traumatization of descendant communities. In the final analysis, the story of Pata Seca represents both the depths of human cruelty and the persistence of human dignity under impossible circumstances. His life reminds us that every system of oppression depends on the reduction of human beings to their economic or biological functions, while the resistance and survival of people like him demonstrates the ultimate failure of such systems to completely destroy human worth and connection. Understanding his story requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about historical and contemporary forms of exploitation, while also recognizing the ongoing struggle for justice, dignity, and the recognition that every person possesses inherent worth that no system of oppression can ultimately destroy.